Have you ever had a day when everything you built suddenly disappeared? In this video, I will tell you my real story in America, the day I lost my job, almost lost my confidence, and even struggled to speak simple English. But through love, family, and small daily conversations, I slowly found a new opportunity and a new life I never expected. The day everything changed. Some days look completely normal until one quiet moment gently pushes your life in a direction you never expected. That morning in America began exactly like that. Cold air moved slowly through the streets, brushing against tall buildings and sleepy traffic lights. The sky was pale, the kind of gray sky that feels calm, but slightly heavy. I stood outside my apartment, holding a cup of cheap coffee, watching people walk quickly to work. Everyone looked busy. Everyone looked confident. Everyone seemed to know exactly where their life was going. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. At that time, I had already been living in the United States for a few years. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable. I had a regular job, a small routine, and just enough English to survive daily conversations. Not impressive English. Not beautiful English. Just practical English. The kind of English that helps you order coffee, talk to coworkers, and understand maybe 70% of what people say. If someone spoke slowly, I understood almost everything. If someone spoke fast, well, that was another story. Anyone learning English in America quickly notices something surprising. Native speakers move through words like cars on a highway. Sentences slide together. Sounds disappear. Small words melt into the air. For a learner, the brain sometimes feels like it's chasing a train that already left the station. Scientists actually explain this in a simple way. When the brain processes a second language, it must decode sound, connect meaning, and react emotionally at the same time. When speech becomes too fast, the brain experiences stress. And when the brain feels stress, learning slows down. That's why slow storytelling works so well for language learning. Stories relax the brain. The brain begins to predict meaning. And when prediction happens, understanding grows naturally. Back then, I didn't know any of that science. I just knew I had to try. Every day. My office building stood quietly on a busy street. Nothing fancy. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly above rows of desks. The coffee machine made its usual noisy sounds. Coworkers chatted about the weather, sports, or weekend plans. Americans love talking about the weather. Cold today. Yeah, winter's coming. Simple sentences. Short conversations. But these small exchanges carry an important social function. In American culture, casual talk builds comfort before deeper conversations begin. Language is not only about grammar. It's about connection. That morning felt completely routine. I turned on my computer, checked emails, and greeted a few coworkers. Morning. Morning. Small English again. Then around noon, something unexpected happened. My manager walked toward my desk and spoke calmly. Can you come to my office for a minute? Nothing unusual. Meetings happen all the time. Maybe it was about a project. Maybe it was about scheduling. Maybe it was something simple. His office door closed softly behind me. The room felt strangely quiet. Managers usually smile easily when conversations are normal. But this time his expression looked careful, almost uncomfortable. Then something interesting happened. He began speaking slowly, very slowly. And when Americans suddenly slow down their speech like that, the brain sometimes understands the message before the heart is ready to accept it. Our company is making some changes, he said. Changes. Such a simple word. But inside companies, the word changes often hides difficult news. He continued explaining. Budget adjustments. New strategy. Restructuring. Corporate language has a special way of dancing around the truth. Finally, the sentence arrived. We have to let some people go.
My name was on that list.
The moment felt strangely quiet. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just quiet. Many people imagine losing a job as a loud moment. But often it feels more like a pause in reality, as if the world presses a temporary buffering button. My thoughts slowed down. What happens next? How will I pay rent? Am I good enough? In the United States, work carries deep meaning. When Americans meet someone new, one of the first questions is often, "What do you do?" It sounds like a simple question about employment, but it also connects to identity. Job equals stability. Job equals direction. Job equals belonging. Walking back to my desk felt different than before. Nothing around me had changed. The same lights. The same office noise. The same coworkers typing on keyboards. But suddenly, everything felt temporary. I packed my belongings slowly. A notebook. A coffee mug. A pen I liked using. A small photograph. Strange how ordinary objects become emotional when you realize they represent an entire chapter of your life. Outside, the afternoon wind had grown stronger. The city moved normally. Cars passed. People laughed. Somebody nearby argued on the phone. Life continued as if nothing important had happened. But inside my mind, something had shifted. Back in my apartment, silence filled the room. Not peaceful silence. Heavy silence. That kind of silence where the mind begins asking uncomfortable questions. What now? Was my English strong enough for another job? Was my experience enough? Many immigrants know this feeling well. When confidence drops, language ability can suddenly feel weaker. Psychologists describe this clearly. Confidence affects cognitive performance. When anxiety increases, the brain protects itself by slowing communication. Words feel stuck. Sentences become shorter. Even simple English becomes difficult. That evening, I sat near the window watching the city lights slowly appear across the skyline. Each light represented someone else's life continuing normally. Work, family, plans, dreams. My future suddenly felt open again. And honestly, that openness felt frightening. But something interesting about life often appears later in the story. The moments that feel like endings sometimes become beginnings wearing a disguise. At that moment, I didn't know it yet. I didn't know that losing this job would lead me toward love, marriage, children, and a completely new opportunity in America. Right then, only 3 facts felt real. My job was gone. My confidence had dropped. And my English suddenly felt smaller than yesterday. But the most surprising part of the story? It started only 3 days later, with a simple conversation, and a woman standing in line at a small coffee shop. A quiet apartment, loud thoughts. Silence can be louder than traffic. That was the strange discovery waiting for me inside my apartment after losing my job in America. The door closed softly behind me, and suddenly the world became very quiet. No office noise.
No coworkers laughing.
No keyboards clicking like small machines building the future. Just silence. And thoughts. Too many thoughts. The apartment itself was small but comfortable. A simple couch near the window, a small kitchen that always smelled a little like coffee, and a narrow hallway that connected everything together like a quiet tunnel. Nothing luxurious, but it had been my safe place. That evening, however, it felt different. The same walls suddenly felt closer. The same furniture looked unfamiliar. Losing a job can do that to a place. The environment doesn't change, but your mind starts seeing everything through a new lens. A heavier lens. Outside the window, the American city kept moving normally. Cars rolled through intersections. Neon signs flickered awake. Somewhere in the distance, a siren sang its usual urban song. Life did not pause just because my life had. I sat on the couch and stared at my phone. No new emails. No new messages. Just a quiet screen reflecting the uncertainty inside my mind. When people talk about losing motivation, they often imagine dramatic sadness. But the real experience is more subtle. Motivation doesn't disappear like a light turning off. It fades. Slowly. Like sunlight leaving the sky at sunset. Psychologists describe this moment as a confidence disruption. When something important disappears, like a job, a relationship, or a major goal, the brain temporarily loses its sense of direction. And when direction disappears, energy follows. That evening, my brain began replaying conversations from work. Did I misunderstand something? Did my English cause problems? Was I too quiet in meetings? Language learners often carry a hidden fear. Maybe the problem isn't the job. Maybe the problem is the language. In reality, companies make decisions for many reasons: budgets, strategies, numbers on spreadsheets that no employee ever sees. But the human brain prefers simple explanations. And unfortunately, the brain often chooses the harshest explanation. Maybe you're not good enough. That thought is powerful and dangerous. Researchers studying language learning discovered something interesting. Self-doubt can reduce listening comprehension by almost 30%. When people worry about their ability, the brain uses more energy on fear and less energy on understanding. In other words, doubt steals mental power. And that night, doubt was very active in my mind. To distract myself, I opened a notebook where I sometimes practiced English. Inside were small sentences from daily life. I went to the store today. The weather is cold. I talked to my coworker. Very simple English. But those sentences represented effort. Consistency. Tiny progress happening slowly over time. Looking at those pages reminded me of something important. Language is not learned in one big moment. It grows through many small moments. One conversation. One mistake. One story. One day at a time. Still, knowing that idea didn't immediately solve my problem. The real question remained. What should I do now? Another job? Another city? Another direction entirely? The American job market moves quickly, but it can also feel competitive. People apply for hundreds of positions. Resumes travel through invisible computer systems before reaching human eyes. Sometimes opportunity arrives fast. Sometimes it takes time. That uncertainty can feel uncomfortable, especially when rent is waiting. To clear my mind, I decided to take a short walk. The evening air felt colder now, and the sidewalks carried the gentle rhythm of city life. Couples walked past holding hands. A group of students laughed loudly near a bus stop. Life looked simple for them. Or at least it appeared simple from the outside. Walking has an interesting effect on the brain. Scientists discovered that movement helps reorganize thoughts. When the body moves forward, the mind often begins moving forward too. Step by step. Idea by idea. That short walk didn't solve my problems, but it did create space between my thoughts. Sometimes space is enough. On the way home, I passed a small coffee shop I had visited many times before. Warm yellow light spilled through the windows. Inside, people sat quietly with laptops or books. Coffee shops in America are interesting cultural spaces. They are not just places to drink coffee. They are places where people think,
Right.
study, plan their future. For a moment, I stood outside the window watching people inside. Everyone seemed busy with something meaningful. A strange thought appeared in my mind. Maybe this unexpected pause in my life was not only a loss. Maybe it was also a reset. Not a dramatic life change. Just a small shift in direction. But that idea felt fragile, like a new plant growing through concrete. I returned to my apartment, made a simple dinner, and opened my laptop again. Instead of job websites, something else caught my attention. A video of someone practicing English through storytelling. The speaker wasn't using complicated vocabulary, just simple words, clear sentences, real-life experiences. And suddenly something clicked in my mind. English doesn't grow through perfection. It grows through stories. Stories connect emotions, memories, and language at the same time. And memory systems. That combination makes learning stronger. Listening becomes easier. Speaking becomes more natural. That night, an idea slowly began forming. What if my own life could become the story? What if losing my job was not just a problem, but the beginning of a story worth telling? Of course, I didn't know yet how important that idea would become. And I definitely didn't know that only a few days later, inside that same small coffee shop, a completely unexpected conversation would begin. A conversation with a stranger. A conversation in simple English. A conversation that would quietly change the direction of my life in America. And strangely enough, that conversation would begin with the most ordinary sentence imaginable. Is this seat taken? My love story begins. Some life-changing moments don't arrive with dramatic music or big announcements. They appear quietly, like someone asking a simple question in a coffee shop. 3 days after losing my job, I walked back to the same small cafe near my apartment. The weather was colder now. Thin clouds covered the sky, and the wind carried that dry American winter smell, coffee, car exhaust, and distant snow somewhere far away. Inside the cafe, warm yellow lights softened everything. The place was calm, but alive. A few students typed on laptops. A man in the corner read a newspaper slowly. Soft jazz music floated through the air like background decoration. Coffee shops in America have a strange magic. People come here not only to drink coffee. They come here to think, to work, to study, to rebuild small pieces of their life. That day, I ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu and sat at a small table near the window. My notebook rested beside the cup. It was the same notebook where I practiced simple English sentences. I opened a blank page. For a moment, nothing happened. The mind sometimes freezes when life feels uncertain. Psychologists call this the decision pause. When the brain faces too many possibilities, it stops choosing entirely. Instead, it waits. So I waited. Outside the window, people passed by quickly. Some carried shopping bags. Others held steaming cups of coffee, walking with the calm confidence of people who knew where they were going. I looked down at the notebook again and wrote a simple sentence. I lost my job last week. It was not beautiful English, but it was honest English. Then another sentence appeared. I feel confused about my future. And another. I am trying to stay calm. Something interesting happens when language learners write about real emotions. The brain becomes more active. Emotional memory helps vocabulary appear faster. In other words, truth helps language flow. I was writing slowly when I heard a voice beside me. Excuse me, is this seat taken? I looked up. A woman stood next to the table holding a cup of coffee and a small laptop bag. She wore a simple gray coat, and a few strands of hair moved slightly in the warm air of the cafe. For a moment, my brain switched into language learning mode. When a native speaker talks unexpectedly, the mind performs a fast translation process.
Sound.
Meaning. Response. 3 steps happening almost instantly. No, it's free, I said. She smiled and sat down. Thank you, she replied. Then she opened her laptop and began typing. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Just 2 strangers sitting at the same small table, working quietly. But something interesting about human psychology is this. When 2 people share space, curiosity slowly grows. And curiosity often leads to conversation. A few minutes later, she glanced at my notebook. You're writing a story? She asked. Her voice sounded friendly, not intrusive. I hesitated for a second. My English practice, I explained. Ah, she said with a warm smile. That's a good way to learn. Then she asked a question that surprised me. What's the story about? I looked at the notebook again. My life, the little, I answered. She laughed softly. Those are usually the best stories. That sentence stayed in my mind. The best stories. Not perfect grammar. Not complicated vocabulary. Just real life. We continued talking in simple English. She spoke slowly after noticing that I sometimes paused before answering. That small act of patience made the conversation easier. Her name was Emily. She grew up in another state, but had moved to this city a few years earlier for work. She worked in design, something creative that involved ideas, colors, and digital tools. Our conversation moved slowly, but comfortably. Sometimes I searched for the right word. Sometimes I explained things with very simple sentences. Surprisingly, she never looked impatient. In fact, she seemed interested. That surprised me. Language learners often imagine that native speakers judge every mistake. But research shows something different. Most people focus on communication, not perfection. Meaning matters more than grammar. Emotion matters more than vocabulary. At one point, Emily noticed the sentence I had written earlier. I lost my job last week. She read it quietly. That must be tough, she said gently. The way she said it felt sincere, not dramatic. Just human. Something about that moment made me speak more honestly than usual. Yes, I'm still thinking about what to do next. She nodded thoughtfully. You know, she said, sometimes losing something creates space for something better. That sentence sounded simple, but the human brain loves simple truths. Psychologists explain that during uncertain periods, supportive social interaction reduces stress hormones. Even short conversations with strangers can increase feelings of optimism. In other words, connection changes the chemistry of the mind. Our conversation continued for almost an hour. We talked about small things, American food, weather differences, funny language mistakes. At one point I told her how confusing English phrasal verbs could be. Look up, look out, look into, look after. She laughed. Even native speakers get confused sometimes. That made me feel strangely relieved. Eventually the cafe became quieter. Evening lights outside the window reflected softly on the glass. Emily packed her laptop slowly. Well, she said, I should go. Then she paused. You come here often? The question sounded casual, but something inside my mind noticed the possibility hidden inside it. Yes, I replied. I like writing here. She smiled. Maybe I'll see you again then. And just like that, she walked toward the door and disappeared into the evening streets. The conversation had lasted less than an hour, but something subtle had shifted. The heavy silence inside my life felt lighter. My English had worked. Not perfect, not impressive, but real. And sometimes real communication is enough to start something unexpected. Back in my notebook, I wrote another sentence. I met someone today. At that moment, I didn't know something important yet. That small conversation in a quiet coffee shop would slowly grow into friendship, then into love, then into a life I never imagined when I first arrived in America. But before any of that could happen, another challenge was waiting. Because the next weeks without a job would test something deeper than my English. They would test my confidence. And confidence, as it turns out, is the real language behind every opportunity. Cultural surprises in America. Life in America teaches many lessons. Some lessons come from books. Some come from work. But the most surprising lessons arrive through everyday moments that seem small at first. After meeting Emily in the coffee shop, something in my daily routine slowly changed. I still didn't have a job. My future was still uncertain. But suddenly, the city around me began to feel less cold. Not because the weather changed, because my perspective did. A few days later, I returned to the same coffee shop again. The door opened with that familiar soft bell sound. Warm air and the smell of roasted coffee beans wrapped around the room. And there she was. Emily sat near the window again, typing on her laptop. When she looked up and recognized me, her smile appeared immediately. Hey, story writer, she said playfully. That nickname made me laugh. In English, humor often becomes the bridge between strangers. It relaxes the conversation. It removes pressure from grammar and vocabulary. Suddenly, language becomes lighter.
I raplia.
Working again? Always, she said, closing her laptop. Creative work never ends. I sat across from her with my notebook again. Slowly, our conversations became a small routine. Not every day. Not every week. Just sometimes. But those conversations taught me something deeper about American culture. Americans are surprisingly open with strangers. In many cultures, people prefer building long relationships before discussing personal topics. But in the United States, small personal stories appear quickly in conversation. Where you grew up, why you moved, what you dream about doing in the future. At first, this surprised me, but psychologists explain something interesting. American culture values individuality and personal expression. Talking about life experiences helps people understand each other quickly. Stories replace long introductions. Emily asked many questions about my life. How did you come to the U.S.? What was your first job here? What surprised you the most about living here? Answering those questions forced me to speak more English than usual. Sometimes my sentences were simple. Sometimes my grammar was not perfect. But communication still happened. That is one of the most powerful lessons for language learners. Fluency grows through interaction, not perfection. One afternoon, the conversation turned toward cultural differences. Emily asked, "What confused you most when you first arrived here?" I laughed immediately. Too many things. She leaned forward, curious. Like what? I thought for a moment. First, the weather. She laughed. The weather? Yes, I said. In some places here, one day is warm, the next day is freezing. That's actually a real challenge in many American cities. Climate changes quickly depending on the season and the region. Emily nodded. Fair point. American weather can be dramatic. Then I added another observation. And people walk very fast. She laughed louder this time. We do, don't we? In large American cities, speed is part of the lifestyle. People move quickly, talk quickly, and schedule life carefully. But something else surprised me even more. Work culture. In my first job, I explained, people worked very hard. But they also talked about work-life balance all the time. Emily nodded again. That's a big idea here. Work-life balance means protecting personal time even while working hard. Family dinners, weekend trips, hobbies, these things are considered important for mental health. Researchers actually support this idea. Studies show that balanced lifestyles improve long-term productivity and emotional well-being. But learning that balance takes time, especially for immigrants trying to prove themselves. During those weeks without a job, I began observing American life more carefully. Without daily office routines, my schedule became flexible. Flexible schedules can feel scary at first, but they also create space for reflection. In the mornings, I sometimes walked through the city park. People jogged with headphones. Parents pushed strollers. Dogs ran freely across green grass. American parks are interesting places. They show how people relax, socialize, and spend time with family. One morning, Emily joined me for coffee before work. We sat outside, watching early sunlight move across the street. You know, she said suddenly, you talk about life in a really interesting way. That comment surprised me. My English is simple, I said. But your stories are real, she replied. People connect with real stories. Her words reminded me of something important about communication. Clarity beats complexity. Psychologists studying language comprehension found that listeners understand emotional narratives much more easily than technical explanations. Stories activate empathy. Empathy increases attention. Attention improves learning. In other words, stories help the brain listen. That idea slowly began forming inside my mind again. Maybe my life experiences were not just personal memories. Maybe they were also lessons. Lessons about language. Lessons about culture. Lessons about starting over. Later that afternoon, Emily asked another question. What are you planning to do now? The question hung quietly in the air between us. For a moment, I didn't have a confident answer. I'm still figuring that out, I admitted. She nodded thoughtfully. You know something interesting, she said.
What?
Sometimes the best opportunities appear when we stop following our original plan. That sentence sounded simple, but life often hides truth inside simple sentences. When we lose something important, like a job, we think the story is ending. But sometimes it's only changing direction. At that moment, I still didn't know where my direction would lead. New job? New skill? New career? The future remained unclear. But one thing had quietly improved. My confidence in English conversations. Not because my vocabulary suddenly expanded. Because fear had started disappearing. Fear often blocks language growth more than grammar mistakes. And every conversation with Emily slowly removed that fear. But something unexpected was about to happen next. A small suggestion. One simple idea from Emily. An idea that would eventually open a completely new opportunity in my life. And strangely enough, that opportunity would begin with something I never planned to do. Speaking English on camera. Losing confidence, losing words. Confidence is a strange thing. When it's strong, words come easily. Conversations feel natural. Even mistakes become small and harmless. But when confidence disappears, something unusual happens inside the brain. Words hide. Sentences become shorter. And suddenly, speaking a language that once felt okay becomes strangely difficult again. That was exactly what happened to me during the weeks after losing my job. From the outside, life still looked normal. The city kept moving. The coffee shop stayed warm and welcoming. Emily and I continued having occasional conversations. But inside my mind, something quieter was happening. A slow drop in confidence. Psychologists describe this as a temporary identity shock. When a person loses an important role like a job, the brain begins questioning other abilities too. If the job disappears, maybe the skills disappear too. Of course, that thought is not logical. But the brain doesn't always follow logic. One afternoon in the coffee shop, Emily asked a simple question. So, have you applied for new jobs yet? A very normal question. But my answer came out slower than expected. I started looking. The pause between words felt uncomfortable. My English hadn't changed, but my confidence had. And confidence affects language more than people realize. Researchers studying second language performance discovered something surprising. Anxiety can reduce speaking fluency almost immediately. The brain begins overthinking grammar and vocabulary instead of simply communicating. In other words, fear interrupts the natural flow of language. That day, I noticed something strange about myself. Instead of telling stories like before, I started giving shorter answers. Yes. Maybe. I'm thinking. Emily noticed the difference too. You seem quieter today, she said gently. I smiled, but she was right. Silence had returned. Not the peaceful silence of thinking, but the heavy silence of doubt. Later that evening, I walked home again through the busy American streets. Cars rushed past. People spoke quickly on their phones. Restaurants filled with laughter and bright lights. The world continued confidently. But inside my head, a small voice kept repeating the same question. What if I'm not good enough? Language learners know this voice very well. It appears after mistakes, after misunderstandings, after moments when words refuse to come out correctly. But here is something fascinating about the human brain. Neuroscientists discovered that self-doubt activates the same neural pathways as physical danger. When the brain senses a threat to identity or social belonging, it releases stress chemicals. These chemicals prepare the body to protect itself. But they also reduce creativity and communication. So, the more you worry about speaking well, the harder speaking becomes. Back in my apartment, I opened my English notebook again. The same notebook where I had written simple sentences before. But tonight, the blank page looked intimidating. What should I write? My life is confusing? My future is uncertain? Those sentences felt too heavy. Instead, I wrote something simpler. Today I felt nervous speaking English. Then another sentence appeared. I know my English is not the problem. Writing that sentence felt strange. But it was true. The real problem was not vocabulary. It was belief. Many successful language learners say the same thing. Confidence grows faster when the brain focuses on communication instead of perfection. Perfection is a trap. Communication is freedom. Still, knowing that idea didn't magically remove my doubts. The mind needed something stronger. Something real. The next morning, Emily sent me a short message. Coffee today? That small message felt surprisingly encouraging. Sometimes motivation returns through connection. Human beings are social learners. Studies show that supportive relationships increase persistence during difficult learning periods. In simple words, encouragement from others helps the brain keep trying. When I arrived at the coffee shop later that day, Emily was already there. She looked up and smiled. You look like someone who didn't sleep much, she said. I laughed. Maybe a little. She studied my expression carefully. Then she said something unexpected. You know, losing a job doesn't erase your abilities. I nodded slowly. I know. But sometimes the brain needs reminders, she added. That sentence felt very accurate. Reminders matter. That afternoon, we talked about language learning again. Emily had studied another language in college, so she understood the struggle. Something interesting happens when people learn languages, she explained. They think mistakes are embarrassing. Are they not? I asked. She shook her head. Not really. Mistakes show that you're trying. Then she added something even more surprising. Actually, mistakes make stories more interesting. That made me curious. What do you mean? She smiled. People remember imperfect stories better than perfect speeches. Her point had scientific support. Psychologists studying storytelling found that authenticity increases emotional engagement. When listeners hear small imperfections, they feel the speaker is real. Real stories create connection. And that idea stayed in my mind long after the conversation ended. Maybe losing confidence was not the end of my English journey. Maybe it was just another chapter. A difficult chapter, but still part of the story. Later that evening, I opened my notebook again. This time the blank page felt less intimidating. I wrote another sentence. I want to share my real story in English. then another. Even if my English is simple. Something interesting happened while writing those words. Confidence didn't suddenly explode, but it quietly returned, like the first light appearing before sunrise. And somewhere inside my mind, a new thought slowly formed. If real stories help people learn English, maybe my story could help someone too. At that moment, it was just an idea, a small idea. But sometimes small ideas grow into unexpected opportunities. And in my case, that opportunity would appear sooner than I ever imagined. Because the next conversation with Emily would introduce a suggestion so surprising, it would completely change the direction of my life in America. A suggestion that began with one simple sentence. You should try telling your story online. A small conversation, a big change. Big life changes rarely begin with dramatic announcements. More often, they begin with a quiet sentence that almost sounds like a casual suggestion. That moment arrived on a calm afternoon in the same small coffee shop where Emily and I had been talking for weeks. Outside, winter clouds moved slowly across the sky. The streets looked gray and sleepy, and people walked quickly with their jackets zipped tight against the cold wind. Inside the cafe, everything felt warm and calm. The coffee machines hummed softly. A few students whispered while studying. Someone typed quickly on a laptop near the wall. Emily sat across from me, holding a cup of coffee with both hands. Our conversation had been light that day. We talked about movies, about strange American food combinations, and about how confusing English idioms could be. At one point I joked, "Why do people say break a leg when they wish you good luck?" Emily laughed. Honestly, I don't know either. Moments like that made English feel less intimidating. When language becomes playful, the brain relaxes. And when the brain relaxes, communication becomes easier. Then suddenly, Emily said something unexpected. "You tell stories really well." I looked up from my notebook. "Even with simple English?" "Especially with simple English," she replied. That surprised me. Most language learners believe that better vocabulary creates better communication. But research in communication psychology shows something different. Clarity and emotion often matter more than complexity. In other words, people remember how a story feels, not how complicated the words were. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair. "You know something interesting?" she continued. "What?" I asked. "There are millions of people trying to learn English around the world." I nodded. "That's true. But most learning materials are boring," she said. Textbooks.
Grammar exercises.
Artificial conversations. She paused for a moment. But real-life stories? Those are powerful. Her words stayed in the air between us. Then she said the sentence that would change everything. "You should try telling your story online." For a moment I thought I misunderstood. "Online?" "Yeah," she said casually.
Videos.
"Stories. Something simple." I laughed nervously. My English is not good enough for that. That was my immediate reaction. The brain protects itself from unfamiliar risks. Psychologists call this cognitive safety behavior. When the mind senses possible embarrassment, it quickly creates excuses to avoid the situation. Emily didn't argue. She simply asked a question. "Good enough for what?" I paused. "For teaching English." She shook her head gently. "Not teaching.
Sharing."
That single word felt important.
Sharing.
There's a big difference between teaching and sharing. Teaching suggests authority and expertise. Sharing suggests honesty and experience. Anyone can share a story, even with imperfect English. Emily continued explaining her idea. You could talk about your life in America, culture differences, learning English through real situations. She pointed at my notebook. You already write these stories. That's just practice, I said. But practice can become something meaningful, she replied. Her idea sounded simple, but inside my mind it felt huge. Speak English on camera? Share my personal story with strangers? What if people laughed at my mistakes? Fear began appearing immediately. Fear is very creative when it comes to protecting comfort zones. But Emily calmly added something important. People learning English don't need perfect speakers. She took another sip of coffee. They need real speakers. That sentence felt powerful. Real speakers. Researchers studying language learning platforms discovered something interesting. Learners engage longer with authentic storytelling content than with traditional classroom lessons.
Why?
Because stories feel human. Human experiences create emotional connection. And emotional connection increases motivation. In simple terms, stories make people want to keep listening. Emily looked at me again. Imagine someone sitting at home somewhere in the world, she said. Maybe they feel nervous about speaking English. Then they watch your story and realize simple English works. The idea slowly entered my mind. Maybe sharing imperfect English could actually help others. Not because it was perfect, because it was real. Still, doubt remained. What if nobody watches? I asked. Emily smiled. That's not the important question. What is? The important question is, will the right person watch? Her answer felt unexpectedly wise. The internet is a strange place. Millions of voices speak every day, but sometimes one small voice reaches exactly the person who needs it. Communication is not about reaching everyone. It's about reaching someone. The conversation continued for another hour. Emily suggested simple ideas. Short stories.
Clear speech.
Real experiences. Nothing complicated. You don't need fancy equipment, she said. Just your phone and honesty. The more she explained, the more the idea felt possible. Not easy, but possible. Later that evening, I walked home again through the familiar city streets. But something inside my mind felt different. Instead of thinking about failure, I was thinking about possibility. Possibility is powerful. Neuroscientists discovered that imagining positive outcomes activates the brain's motivation systems. When people visualize opportunity, dopamine levels increase. Dopamine encourages action. Action creates momentum. And momentum builds confidence. Back in my apartment, I placed my phone on the table. Then I looked around the room. Simple couch. Small window. Quiet walls. Nothing special. But maybe special things could begin in ordinary places. I opened my notebook again and wrote a new sentence. Today someone gave me a strange idea. Then another sentence. Maybe my story can help people learn English. The thought still felt risky. Still uncomfortable. Still uncertain. But something inside my mind felt curious. And curiosity is stronger than fear. That night, I slept with a strange question in my head. What would happen if I actually tried? The next morning would bring the answer. because the very first time I pressed the record button on my phone, something unexpected happened. Something that would slowly open a new opportunity one never imagined after losing my job in America. And strangely enough, that opportunity would begin with the most awkward English introduction of my life. Learning English through real life. The first time I tried recording myself speaking English, the experience felt strange. Not exciting. Not confident. Just strange. The phone stood on the small table in my apartment, leaning against a stack of books. The camera pointed toward me, waiting silently. Outside the window, the city moved normally. Cars passing, people walking, distant sounds of everyday life. Inside the room, however, everything felt different. It was the quiet pressure of a red recording button. Anyone who has tried speaking in a new language knows this moment. When you talk with friends, words come naturally. But when a camera appears, the brain suddenly becomes extremely aware of every sentence, every pronunciation, every pause. Psychologists call this the observer effect. When people know they are being watched or recorded, the brain becomes more cautious. It tries to avoid mistakes. Ironically, that effort often creates more mistakes. I stared at the camera for a few seconds. Then I pressed record. The phone screen showed my face looking slightly nervous. I cleared my throat and began speaking slowly. Hello, my name is... Then I stopped. Something about the moment felt awkward. My brain began analyzing everything. Is my pronunciation okay? Am I speaking too slowly? Is my grammar correct? 10 seconds later, I pressed stop. First attempt, 10 seconds long. That was it. I watched the video immediately. The voice sounded unfamiliar. Most people experience this when hearing their own recorded voice. Sound travels differently through air than through the bones of a skull, so recordings often feel strange at first. But something else caught my attention. My English was simple but understandable. That realization felt important. Language learners often underestimate themselves. We focus on mistakes instead of clarity. But communication research shows that listeners mainly care about meaning, not perfection. If meaning arrives clearly, communication succeeds. Encouraged by that thought, I pressed record again. This time I tried telling a small story. I moved to America a few years ago. The sentences came slowly. Sometimes I paused. Sometimes I repeated a word. But something interesting happened during the second attempt. My brain relaxed. Instead of worrying about grammar, I focused on the story. Storytelling activates a different mental process. Neuroscientists discovered that narrative thinking engages memory and emotional centers of the brain. When those systems activate, language production becomes more natural. Stories guide words. Words follow emotions. After a few minutes, I stopped recording again. This time the video lasted almost 2 minutes. 2 minutes of simple English. 2 minutes of a real story. I watched it carefully. The grammar wasn't perfect. The pronunciation wasn't perfect. But something surprising appeared on the screen. Honesty. Real experience. Real emotion. Emily had been right about something. Stories create connection. That evening I sent the video to her. Her reply arrived quickly. This is great. I laughed. Great is a big word. I wrote back. She answered immediately. No, I mean it. Your story feels real. That word again. Real. The next day, I recorded another short story, this time about my first confusing experience with American weather. I explained how one morning felt warm, and by evening the temperature dropped dramatically. The story was simple. But while speaking, I noticed something fascinating. My English sounded more natural when describing real memories. Scientists explain this through emotional memory theory. When people talk about personal experiences, the brain accesses stored sensory details, images, feelings, sounds. These details help sentences flow more easily. Language becomes connected to life. Life creates fluency. Within a week, I had recorded several short stories. One about my first job interview in America. One about confusing English expressions. One about the small coffee shop where I often practice speaking. Each video remained simple.
No complicated vocabulary.
No fast speech. Just slow, clear storytelling. The process itself became a learning method. Speaking out loud forced my brain to organize thoughts more clearly. Listening to the recordings helped me notice pronunciation patterns. This method actually has strong scientific support. Linguists call it active output practice. Producing language, speaking or writing, strengthens neural pathways much faster than passive listening alone. In simple words, using language builds language. One afternoon I showed Emily a few of the recordings. We watched them together at the cafe. She smiled after the first video finished. "You're improving already." "Really?" I asked.
Yeah.
"Your confidence is different." Confidence again. That mysterious ingredient behind communication. When the brain stops fearing mistakes, language becomes flexible. Words arrive faster. Sentences grow longer. And suddenly speaking English feels less like a test and more like a conversation. Emily leaned forward. "You know what you should do next?" "What?" "Share one of these videos." My stomach tightened immediately. Share? Publicly? The internet suddenly felt like a giant stage. Fear returned quickly. What if people criticize my English? I asked. Emily shrugged gently. Then they're missing the point. What's the point? She smiled. The point is courage. Courage. That word stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Later that night, back in my apartment, I opened my laptop again. My short videos sat quietly on the screen, waiting. They looked small, simple, unpolished, but they also represented something bigger.
Trying.
Trying after failure. Trying after losing confidence. Trying after losing a job in a foreign country. That effort alone felt meaningful. I hesitated for a long time before clicking the upload button. My finger hovered above the mouse. Then finally,
click.
The video began uploading. A small progress bar moved slowly across the screen. 10%, 30%, 70%. And just like that, my story was suddenly out there in the world. Somewhere, waiting for someone to press play. At that moment, I didn't expect anything dramatic. Maybe a few views. Maybe nothing at all. But the next morning, something surprising would happen. Something small, but powerful. Because somewhere, someone would watch that simple video and leave a comment that would change how I saw this entire journey. A comment that proved something important. Sometimes the smallest stories travel farther than we ever imagine. Love, marriage, and responsibility. The first comment on my video appeared early the next morning. I didn't notice it immediately. In fact, I almost forgot about the video completely. After uploading it the night before, I told myself not to expect anything. The internet is enormous. Millions of videos appear every day. Why would anyone notice mine? But curiosity is a powerful habit. When I opened my laptop that morning, the first thing I did almost automatically was check the video. There it was. One comment. Just one. But that single sentence felt strangely powerful. Your English is easy to understand. Please share more stories. I stare at the screen for a few seconds. Easy to understand. Not perfect. Not impressive. Just understandable. That comment revealed something important about communication. Clarity matters more than complexity. Linguists studying global English communication discovered that most English conversations worldwide happen between non-native speakers. In those situations, clear and simple language often works better than complicated vocabulary. In other words, understandable English is powerful English. That small comment gave me a strange feeling of encouragement. Somewhere in the world, a person had watched my story and understood it. Even more surprising, they wanted another one. Later that afternoon, I told Emily about it while we sat in our usual coffee shop. One comment already, she said, smiling. That's how it begins. It's only one person, I replied. One person is still a human life, she said. Her point was simple but meaningful. Behind every screen is a real person. Real fears. Real goals. Real effort to learn something new. That idea changed how I thought about sharing stories. Instead of imagining a huge invisible audience, I started imagining one learner at a time. Someone sitting at home somewhere, trying to improve their English through real-life experiences. That perspective made recording new videos feel less scary. Within the next few weeks, I continued uploading short stories. Some about cultural surprises in America. Some about my early struggles with English. Some about funny misunderstandings. Slowly, the small collection of videos grew. 5 videos.
10 videos.
Then more. But something else in my life was growing too. My relationship with Emily. At first, we were simply two people who enjoyed talking in a coffee shop. Conversations felt easy, natural, sometimes funny. But over time, those conversations became deeper. We talked about childhood memories, about family traditions, about hopes for the future. Human relationships grow through shared stories. Psychologists explain that storytelling increases emotional bonding because it activates empathy in the brain. When two people share personal experiences, their minds begin building a sense of connection. Connection creates trust. Trust creates closeness. One evening, Emily and I walked through a nearby park after dinner. The air was cool, and the trees moved gently in the night wind. City lights reflected on the path ahead of us. You've been busy with your videos lately, she said. Yeah, I replied. It's becoming a routine. How do you feel about it? I thought for a moment. Surprisingly happy. That answer was honest. Losing my job had felt like losing direction. But telling my story gave me something meaningful again. A small purpose. Emily smiled. You know, it's interesting watching you speak English now. What do you mean? You're more relaxed. She was right. The fear I once felt when speaking had slowly faded. Recording videos forced me to practice expressing ideas clearly. Each story strengthened confidence. Confidence changed everything. Language learning researchers often say that emotional safety is one of the most important conditions for improving fluency. When learners feel safe expressing themselves, the brain stops blocking communication. Confidence removes invisible barriers. As we walked through the quiet park, Emily suddenly stopped and looked at me. "You know something else?" she said softly.
What?
"I think your life story is just beginning." Her words sounded poetic, but they also felt true. Life rarely follows a straight path. Unexpected changes often lead to unexpected opportunities. That night we talked for hours about dreams and future plans, about the kind of life we hope to build. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, something shifted. Our friendship quietly crossed an invisible line. The following months passed quickly. My small storytelling channel continued growing slowly. Comments appeared from different countries. People wrote about practicing listening through the stories. Meanwhile, Emily and I spent more time together. Coffee shops, walks in the park, simple dinners. Nothing dramatic. Just a growing sense of comfort. Eventually, one evening, Emily asked a question that felt both exciting and serious. "Have you ever thought about getting married someday?" The question surprised me, not because the idea was strange, because the moment felt suddenly real. Marriage represents responsibility. In American culture, marriage often means building a partnership where two people support each other's goals and challenges. Responsibility can feel intimidating, but it can also create powerful motivation. Psychologists explain that long-term relationships increase a person's sense of purpose. Purpose improves persistence during difficult situations. In simple terms, when people care deeply about someone else, they try harder to succeed. A year after that first conversation in the coffee shop, Emily and I stood together in a small ceremony with friends and family. Simple.
Warm. Real.
Marriage changed many things in my life, not just emotionally.
Practically.
Now I wasn't only responsible for my own future. I was responsible for our future. That responsibility created new determination. My storytelling videos continued growing slowly, but something else was beginning to happen. An opportunity. An unexpected opportunity connected to the very thing that once made me nervous. Speaking English. And strangely enough, that opportunity would arrive through a message from someone I had never met before. A message that would open a completely new door in my life in America. A new skill, a new door. Life has a strange sense of timing. Sometimes an opportunity appears exactly when you stop looking for it. By the time Emily and I had been married for several months, my life looked very different from the uncertain days after losing my job. The small storytelling videos I recorded in my apartment had quietly become part of my daily routine. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. No viral success. No huge audience. Just slow, steady growth. But something interesting was changing inside me. Confidence. Every week I recorded a new story. Sometimes about cultural differences in America. Sometimes about my early struggles with English. Sometimes about simple moments in daily life. Shopping at a grocery store, misunderstanding a phrase, learning how Americans celebrate holidays. Each story used simple language. Short sentences. Clear pronunciation. At first, I thought people might find this boring. But the comments told a different story. Your English is easy to follow. I practice listening with your videos every morning. Your stories feel real.
Real.
That word continued appearing again and again. Communication researchers explain something important about storytelling. When listeners feel authenticity, their brains activate empathy networks. Empathy increases attention, and attention improves learning. In simple terms, people listen longer when the speaker feels human. My videos were not perfect lessons. They were human stories. Meanwhile, Emily often helped me improve small details. She listened to recordings and sometimes suggested clearer ways to explain certain ideas. Not complicated corrections, just small adjustments. Maybe pause here, she would say. Explain that moment a little more. Her suggestions made the stories easier to understand. In a way, the videos became a shared project. One evening, while checking comments on my latest video, I noticed something unusual. A new message had appeared, but it wasn't a typical viewer comment. It was longer, more detailed. The message began like this. Hello, I've been watching your English storytelling videos for a few weeks. I read slowly. The person explained that they worked for an online language learning platform. Their company created educational content for international learners. And then the message said something that made my heart beat faster. We believe your storytelling style could help many students practice listening. For a moment, I thought I misunderstood the sentence. I read it again. Then again. The message continued. They were interested in collaborating, creating more storytelling content, possibly even designing a series focused on real-life English practice. My first reaction was disbelief.
Me?
Collaborate with an educational platform? The same person who once felt nervous speaking English in a coffee shop? My brain immediately began questioning everything. Maybe they contacted the wrong person. Maybe they misunderstood my videos. Maybe my English wasn't good enough for something like this. Doubt can appear very quickly when opportunity knocks. Psychologists explain that when people experience sudden positive changes, the brain sometimes resists them. This reaction is called imposter syndrome, the fear that success is undeserved. But Emily had a different reaction when I showed her the message. She smiled widely. I told you, she said. Told me what? That your story matters. Her confidence felt stronger than mine at that moment. Still, responding to the message felt intimidating. Professional collaboration meant responsibility. Expectations. Real work. What should I say? I asked. Emily thought for a moment. Just be honest, she replied. The same way you tell your stories. Honesty again. The foundation of everything that had worked so far. So I wrote a reply. My message was simple. I thanked them for watching the videos. I explained that my English was still improving. And I told them that my goal had always been helping people learn through real experiences. Then I pressed send. For the rest of the evening, my mind kept returning to the possibility. A new skill, a new direction, a new door opening. That night, I couldn't sleep easily. My brain replayed the journey that had brought me here.
Losing my job.
Meeting Emily in a coffee shop. Recording awkward first videos in my apartment. Small comments from learners around the world. Each step had seemed ordinary at the time. But together, they created something unexpected. Opportunity rarely arrives in a straight line. It appears through many small moments. 2 days later, the reply arrived. The company loved the idea of real-life storytelling practice. They wanted to schedule an online meeting to discuss possible collaboration. I read the message twice, then a third time. Excitement and nervousness mixed together inside my chest. Emily noticed immediately. "You got the reply, didn't you?" I nodded. "They want to talk." She laughed happily. "Of course they do." But even while smiling, I felt a new type of pressure. This conversation would be different from casual storytelling. It would be professional,
Structured.
important. And suddenly, my brain returned to an old fear. What if my English wasn't strong enough? But Emily said something that completely changed how I saw the situation. "You're forgetting something," she said.
What?
"They contacted you because of your English." That perspective felt powerful. Not despite my English. Because of my English. Because it was simple.
Clear.
Human. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. 7 days. 7 days to prepare. 7 days for excitement and doubt to fight inside my mind. But deep down, something felt clear. Losing my job had once seemed like the worst moment of my life in America. Now it looked like the first step toward something entirely new. And strangely enough, the most surprising part of this story was still waiting ahead. Because the next chapter would bring something even bigger than a collaboration. Something that would transform not only my career, but my entire life as a husband, a father, and a storyteller in America. The opportunity one never expected. The week before the online meeting felt longer than usual. But when you're waiting for something important, time seems to stretch like slow-moving clouds across the sky. Every morning I woke up thinking about the same thing. The meeting. The message from the language learning company still sat in my inbox like a quiet promise of possibility. Sometimes I read it again just to confirm that it was real.
It was.
But believing in opportunity is sometimes harder than recognizing it. Doubt still appeared in my mind at random moments. What if my English isn't professional enough? What if they expect something I can't deliver? The human brain loves creating these questions. Psychologists explain that uncertainty activates the brain's threat detection system. Even positive events can trigger stress when the outcome is unknown. But Emily had a simple response every time I mentioned my worries. "They contacted you for a reason." Her calm confidence helped steady my thoughts. During those 7 days, I prepared in the simplest way possible. I did exactly what I had been doing from the beginning. I told stories. Every evening I practiced speaking out loud. Not complicated speeches. Just small stories about life in America. My first confusing grocery store visit. The time I misunderstood a joke at work. The day I first experienced a real American snowstorm. Practicing stories felt natural because storytelling had already become part of my thinking process. Neuroscientists discovered that when people practice narrative communication, the brain organizes information more efficiently. Stories create structure. Structure creates clarity. Clarity builds confidence. Finally, the day of the meeting arrived. The laptop sat on the table in my apartment. The same small apartment where the first awkward videos had been recorded. Nothing about the room looked impressive. Plain walls. Simple furniture. A quiet window showing the city outside. But something about the moment felt significant. When the video call began, 2 people appeared on the screen. They introduced themselves warmly and thanked me for sharing my stories online. Their English was fast, but my listening had improved a lot over the past months. Slowly, carefully, I followed the conversation. One of them said something that surprised me. Your storytelling style is very effective for learners. Effective. That word sounded almost scientific. They explained that many English learners feel intimidated by complex lessons. But when they hear real experiences told slowly and clearly, the brain processes language more comfortably. In simple words, real life makes language easier. Then they asked a question. Would you be interested in creating a series of storytelling lessons with us? For a moment, my brain paused. A series, not just one video. Multiple lessons. Something bigger than I imagined. Yes, I said carefully. I would like to try. They smiled. That's exactly the spirit we're looking for. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. We discussed ideas about storytelling topics, life experiences, cultural differences, simple English conversations. They believed learners could practice listening and speaking through these real stories. The same idea Emily had suggested in the coffee shop months earlier. At the end of the meeting, they said something that felt even more unexpected. We would also like to pay you for the work. Payment. A professional collaboration. A real opportunity. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a moment staring at the laptop screen. The room looked exactly the same as before. But my life suddenly felt different. Emily arrived home later that evening. The moment she walked through the door, she saw my expression.
Well,
she asked. I smiled slowly. They want to work together. Her reaction was immediate. I knew it. We both laughed. Not the nervous laughter of uncertainty, but the joyful laughter that appears when something finally makes sense. Losing my job months earlier had felt like the end of stability, but now it looked like the beginning of a new path. A path built on something I once considered a weakness. My imperfect English. Researchers studying career transitions discovered something fascinating. Many successful career changes happen when people transform a personal challenge into a useful skill. Struggle becomes experience. Experience becomes knowledge. Knowledge becomes opportunity. That night, Emily and I celebrated with a simple dinner at a small restaurant nearby. Nothing fancy. Just warm food, soft conversation, and quiet excitement about the future. At one point, she asked a question that made me think deeply. Do you remember how you felt the day you lost your job? I nodded slowly. Confused. Scared. And now, she asked. I looked around the restaurant. People talking. Music playing softly. Life moving forward. Now it feels like that moment pushed me in the right direction. Life often hides opportunity behind disappointment. But we rarely see it immediately. Sometimes it takes months. Sometimes years. Looking back, the journey suddenly felt clear.
losing my job.
Meeting Emily. Recording small storytelling videos. Connecting with learners around the world. Each step had quietly led to the next one. But the most meaningful changes were still ahead, because the new storytelling work would bring something even more important than career success.
It would shape our family,
Our future, and eventually the next generation of our story. A chapter involving something completely new in my life. Fatherhood. A new role that would change how I understood love, responsibility, and the true meaning of opportunity in America. And strangely enough, The first sign of that new chapter would arrive through a tiny heartbeat on a doctor's screen. Family, children, and a new life. Life sometimes changes quietly, and sometimes it changes in a single unforgettable moment. For me, that moment happened on an ordinary afternoon when Emily walked into the living room holding a small piece of paper. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. I was sitting at the table, working on a new storytelling script for the English lessons we had started producing with the learning platform. My laptop screen showed a simple title, My First Winter in America. I was practicing sentences out loud, trying to keep the language slow and clear. Then Emily said my name, not loudly, but differently. When someone you love says your name in a new tone, your brain immediately senses something important. I looked up. She was smiling. Not a casual smile. A quiet, emotional smile. I have something to tell you, she said. My first thought was curiosity. My second thought was confusion. Then she handed me the paper. It was a medical test result. And suddenly the meaning appeared clearly in my mind. A baby. A tiny new life was on its way. For a few seconds, the world seemed to pause. Not in a dramatic movie-style way. Just a soft pause where your brain tries to understand that something enormous is happening. I looked at Emily again. You're serious? I asked. She laughed softly. Yes. The word echoed inside my mind like a bell. Yes. A simple word. But that word meant something incredible. A new chapter. A new responsibility. A new type of love. Psychologists say that becoming a parent activates powerful emotional changes in the brain. Hormones connected to protection, empathy, and long-term thinking increase dramatically. In simple terms, your priorities suddenly reorganize. That evening we sat together on the couch, talking about the future in a way we never had before. How do you feel? Emily asked. I thought for a moment. Excited, I said. Then I added another word. Terrified. She laughed again. That's normal. And it was true. Becoming responsible for another human life is both beautiful and overwhelming. But something interesting happened inside my mind that night. The fear felt different from the fear I had experienced after losing my job. That earlier fear had been about uncertainty and survival. This new fear was about responsibility and love. Very different emotions. Over the next months, our lives slowly adjusted to the idea of becoming parents. Doctor visits. Preparing the small apartment. Learning about babies. Everything felt new. Meanwhile, my storytelling work continued growing steadily. The collaboration with the language learning company had become a regular project. Each week I recorded new lessons based on real-life experiences. Stories about culture. Stories about mistakes. Stories about resilience. More and more learners wrote messages saying the stories helped them feel confident practicing English. But something else changed in my storytelling during those months. My perspective. When you know a child will soon enter your life, your thinking becomes more reflective. You begin asking deeper questions. What kind of life do I want my child to see? What kind of example should I become? Those questions quietly influenced the way I told my stories. They became more thoughtful, more honest, more focused on resilience. Resilience is an important psychological concept. It describes the ability to adapt and grow after challenges. Researchers found that people who openly share their struggles often inspire others more effectively than those who only share success. Struggle creates relatability. Relatability creates trust. Trust creates impact. One evening, while recording a story about losing my job months earlier, I realized something surprising. That painful moment had become one of the most meaningful chapters in my life. Without losing that job, I would not have started telling stories. Without telling stories, I would not have met learners around the world. Without those stories, the opportunity with the language learning company might never have appeared. And without visiting that coffee shop so often, I might never have met Emily. Life sometimes rearranges our path in ways we cannot predict. A few months later, the day finally arrived. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft sounds of medical machines. Nurses moved calmly around the room while Emily held my hand tightly. Then suddenly, a tiny cry filled the air. The sound was small, but it felt powerful enough to change the entire universe. Our child had arrived. When the nurse placed the baby in Emily's arms, the moment felt almost surreal. This tiny human being was now part of our story. A new generation. A new beginning. I looked at that small face and felt something I had never experienced before. Responsibility mixed with gratitude. In that moment, the journey from losing my job to holding my child suddenly made sense. Life had not been collapsing. It had been redirecting. The apartment that once felt empty now felt full. The future that once felt uncertain now felt meaningful. And the stories that began as simple English practice had grown into something bigger than I ever expected. But the most important lesson from this entire journey was still waiting to be understood. Because sometimes we must lose something important to discover what truly matters. And that realization would become the final message I wanted to share with every person learning English through my stories. A message about courage, patience, and the strange opportunities hidden inside difficult moments. The lesson hidden inside failure. The first night after bringing our baby home felt strangely quiet. Hospitals are full of soft noises, machines, footsteps, distant voices. But our small apartment was different. The silence felt deeper, almost sacred, like the beginning of something important. Emily gently placed the baby in the crib beside our bed. The tiny blanket moved slightly as our child breathed slowly. For a long moment, we just stood there watching. No words. Just two people realizing that life had changed forever. A few months earlier, I had been sitting in this same apartment feeling lost after losing my job. The future felt uncertain, and I questioned whether I belonged in America at all. Now the same room held a completely different meaning. A family lived here. A new story had begun. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because the baby was crying. Surprisingly, our child slept peacefully. Instead, my mind kept traveling back through the path that had led to this moment.
Losing the job.
Meeting Emily in the coffee shop. Recording awkward English storytelling videos. Receiving the unexpected message from the learning platform. And now, standing beside a crib, looking at the next chapter of life. Human memory has an interesting habit. When we reflect on difficult experiences after time has passed, the brain reorganizes those memories into meaningful patterns. Psychologists call this process meaning-making. In simple words, we begin to understand why certain events happened. And sometimes, failure reveals lessons that success could never teach. The next morning, sunlight entered the apartment slowly through the window. Emily sat on the couch holding the baby carefully while I prepared coffee in the kitchen. The scene looked peaceful, but inside my mind, a powerful thought kept repeating. Everything changed because of one moment, the moment I lost my job. At the time, that event had felt like disaster, embarrassment,
fear,
uncertainty. But now I could see something else. Redirection. Sometimes life quietly pushes us away from a path that no longer belongs to us. We resist. We panic. We believe everything is falling apart. But later, when the dust settles, we realize something important. The door that closed forced us to notice another door. That realization became the inspiration for my next storytelling video. Instead of focusing only on learning English, I wanted to share something deeper with the audience. A lesson. A message for anyone feeling discouraged or ready to give up. That afternoon I sat at the same small table where my storytelling journey had begun. The laptop screen waited for new words. For several minutes, I simply stared at the blinking cursor. Then, the first sentence appeared. Failure is sometimes life's most honest teacher. The sentence felt simple, but it carried truth. I began recording the story slowly, speaking clearly so learners could follow every word. I talked about the day I lost my job, the fear that followed, the confusion about the future. Then I explained how that painful moment unexpectedly created the path that led to storytelling, to meeting Emily, and eventually to building a family. The story was not dramatic. It was real, and authenticity always connects with people. Research in communication psychology shows that audiences respond strongly when speakers share vulnerability. By the time I finished recording, something felt different. The story carried more emotion than previous videos. More reflection. More honesty. After uploading the video, I didn't think much about it at first. I simply returned to daily life, helping Emily, learning how to care for a newborn, and continuing the storytelling lessons with the language learning company. But a few days later, something unexpected happened. The video began spreading faster than any previous story. Comments appeared from viewers all over the world. Some wrote about losing jobs. Others described failing exams. Some shared stories about immigration struggles, learning new languages, or rebuilding life in unfamiliar places. But many comments repeated the same message. Your story gave me hope.
hope,
A small word with enormous meaning. Hope doesn't erase problems. It doesn't guarantee success. But it gives people the energy to continue trying. And sometimes that is enough. One evening, while reading those comments, Emily walked into the room holding our baby. She looked at the screen and smiled. Looks like your story reached a lot of people. I nodded slowly. But the strange thing, I said, is that it all started with something I thought was the worst moment of my life. Emily gently rocked the baby in her arms. That's how many good stories begin, she said. She was right. Stories rarely begin with perfect situations. They begin with conflict, uncertainty, challenge. Without struggle, growth rarely appears. That realization became the final message I wanted to share with my audience. Not just about English learning,
but about life.
Every person watching the channel might face moments of doubt. Moments when progress feels slow. Moments when quitting seems easier than continuing. But hidden inside those difficult moments is often the beginning of transformation. Sometimes the very obstacle that blocks your path becomes the reason you discover a better one. And maybe somewhere in the future, someone watching these stories today will look back at their own struggle and realize the same thing. That the moment they almost gave up was actually the moment their real journey began. Some people believe success begins with talent, luck, or perfect timing. But this story proves something very different. Sometimes success begins the exact moment life breaks your plans. The day I lost my job felt like the end of everything. Confidence disappeared. The future looked uncertain. Even speaking simple English felt like a mountain I couldn't climb. But that difficult moment quietly pushed me towards something unexpected. A new skill, a new voice, a new life. Through small conversations, simple stories, and the courage to keep going even when progress felt slow, everything slowly changed. A career built from storytelling, a family built from love, and a community of learners from around the world sharing the same journey. So if you are watching this video while feeling tired, discouraged, or ready to quit learning English, remember one thing. Your current struggle might be the beginning of your greatest story. And maybe one day, you will look back and realize that the moment you almost gave up was actually the moment everything started to change. But this is only the beginning. Many more real stories, life lessons, and powerful English listening practice are waiting for you on this channel. So before you leave, like this video if this story inspired you. Comment below, what challenge are you facing right now? And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more real-life English stories, motivation, and listening practice that can change the way you learn English. Because the next story we share here might be the one that changes your life too.